Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center's program today, shared by many organizations, including the Polar Institute, the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, and the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. We're here to discuss Nordic security perspectives in the Arctic, and we're joined by many of our friends and colleagues today. Let me first apologize if you hear any ambient noise coming from my microphone, as I'm in the middle of a conference meeting. And if there's background noise, my apologies for that. But I think today's discussion is very timely, very important, because Arctic security is increasingly recognized as a most important role of all of us. Today here in Anchorage, we are talking about the creation of the Ted Stevens Center and its unique focus on Arctic security for the United States. It's the newest DoD center. So you would imagine that for the United States, it's a very important matter. And here at meetings are representatives and others who are discussing Nordic perspectives within the US perspective as well. So this issue today is timely, not just because of the heightened awareness on the importance of Arctic security, but also because of the issues related to the invasion, the continued invasion of Ukraine on Russia. Let me introduce to you our first set of speakers. Always good to have Ambassador Anniken Krutnes, the Ambassador of the Kingdom of Norway to the United States, and Ambassador Lona Wisborg, Ambassador Kingdom of Denmark to the United States. The program will be in two phases. First, each ambassador will have opening comments. I will follow up with a discussion or pull a thread on a particular theme, and then we will move on to another set of questions. And then we will have our second set of panelists who will further explore the issues that we will talk about and learn about this morning. We have 1 hour, so we don't have a whole lot of time. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Ambassador Krutnes for opening comments. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you to the organizers. The Wilson Center's Polar Institute is a dear partner and friend of Norway, and we highly evaluate the cooperation between you and the Fulbright Arctic Initiative and Fridtjof Nansen Institute. This is not the first time I talk about the Arctic. I've been doing that for many years. I used to be Norway's Arctic ambassador and Norway's representative to the Arctic Council. And I always said that Arctic is important for Norway. 10% of our population live in the Arctic. We have cities, we have universities, we need people to live in the Arctic, we need economic activity in the Arctic, just to set the stage. And I can still say that. And then I always said, we see the Arctic as a stable, predictable, prosperous region. And we see high north flow tension. And I'm not sure I can continue saying that because Russia's war on Ukraine had changed the strategic outlook also for the Arctic, I'm afraid. It's too early to say how the war will affect the Arctic. And one fundamental question, of course, is what kind of Russia will come out of the war. The cooperation in the Arctic, and as we see it, the Arctic Council, which is the most important forum for cooperation in the Arctic, is put on hold. It has to be like that. I think cooperation with Russia in the future will be very, very difficult. But the challenges we have in common in the Arctic are not put on hold. They are still there, such as the climate challenge. So we have to figure out a way to work on common challenges in the future. But we do have a problem with Russia, to put it like that. The focus today should be on security, and I'll be brief on that. But as you know, Norway borders Russia in the north. We was a founding member of NATO. And I always say that we are NATO's ears and eyes in the north. We keep an eye on what's going on there. And what we have observed during the last years is that Russia has increased its military capabilities in the Arctic, as well as its civilian infrastructure and also dual use infrastructure. And Norway has been a frontrunner for strengthening NATO's defense and deterrence in the north. In 2008, we launched the Core Area Initiative, and we ourselves invest in high-end capabilities. We're buying 52 F-35 fighter jets. We're buying the maritime surveillance aircraft, P-8, and we're buying new submarines. And we are doing what we can to build up our deterrence in the north. I think we will probably see applications for NATO membership from Sweden and Finland, and that will, of course, change the picture totally. We already have a very, very strong defense cooperation between the Nordic countries, but for Finland and Sweden to be NATO members will, of course, make that cooperation even closer. And it will add capabilities to the alliance. But it will also open up a new NATO border towards Russia. And it will, we will see what kind of reactions it will trigger in Russia. But this is definitely not what Putin wanted and what he foresaw. His idea was to weaken the alliance, and the only thing he gets back is a stronger and more allied NATO. But I think that is something we have to think and discuss. What will the new NATO mean for NATO's posture in the high north? And of course, as I said, we think it is important that in this situation we have deterrence, we have defense in the north, but it cannot be a blueprint of what we do in East Europe. It has to be tailored to the situation in the north. And I will leave it at that for the moment, so that we have a chance to have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Luna, please. You follow up Ambassador Krutnes as her comments. Very many questions I want to ask her, but I'm going to wait till you're done, Ambassador, and then follow up with both of you, please.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mike, and thank you for bringing us together here today to discuss the Nordic states' cooperation with the US in the Arctic. And I must say that I agree with most of what, if not all, that my Norwegian colleague just said, Anniken. But I would also like to offer some perspectives from the Kingdom of Denmark. And as I'm sure that all our viewers are already aware, the Kingdom of Denmark consists of three parts: Denmark, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. And these three governments work very closely together on the areas of defense and security in the Arctic and in the North Atlantic. And of course, this is a cooperation based on equality and mutual respect in accordance with national legislation. And together with the other Arctic states, we have continuously worked for securing the region as an area of low tension. This has been our objective throughout the years. And we believe, the Arctic Council as such, and also the Ilulissat declarations, they are both very good examples of this ambition. But at the same time, as Anniken said, we see the Arctic increasingly affected by rising global rivalry between the great powers. We see the growing military presence in the region, especially Russia, stands out with its extensive military buildup. That has prompted also other Arctic states to strengthen their own Arctic military capabilities. And the same goes for us in the Kingdom of Denmark. We are in the process of strengthening our defense capabilities in the Arctic. The government of Denmark, Greenland, and Faroe Islands are currently in dialogue about a $240 million capability package, which is intended to increase our presence, our sovereignty, ambitions, and priorities that are very important to us. I think also we have to be mindful of the fact that while our capabilities are defensive by nature, Russia's capabilities do include elements that could be used for offensive purposes also. We should also note that the Russian military buildup in the Arctic is not a new development. And so far, we have not seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine increase the tension in the Arctic. But again, it's early days. It's too early to assess the long-term consequences. I would also like to mention that Denmark has decided to increase our overall defense spending massively in order to reach the 2% of GDP by 2033. And a big part of that will be spent in mainland Denmark, but it's also very likely that it will be used to underpin our increased efforts in the Arctic and in the North Atlantic. Maybe just a few comments on cooperation with the US. We collaborate on very many areas, and obviously the cooperation in the Arctic is a cornerstone. The US military has been present at the Thule Air Base, also referred to as Pitufik, in Greenland for more than 70 years. Thule Air Base is an integral part of the US defense and homeland security, but it's also vital to the defense of the Kingdom of Denmark and NATO as a whole. And as some of you might know, recently the US decided to reopen their consulate in Greenland, a clear sign, that's how we read it at least, of the importance of the US partnership with the government of Greenland, as well as the US commitment to ensure that this cooperation will benefit the Greenlandic people and the business community in Greenland. From the Danish side, we very much welcome this increased cooperation in areas such as trade, investment, mining, education, and tourism. And finally, maybe just a few remarks on our cooperation with Norway and the other Nordic countries. I think we can say that Norway and the Kingdom of Denmark, we have a shared outlook when it comes to security in the Arctic and cooperation with the US in this regard. We both provide important capabilities to NATO. We both have very strong bilateral cooperation with the US on security and defense policy. And we have a very good cooperation with Norway also bilaterally. And in addition to our bilateral relations, we are both members of the so-called Nordic Defense Cooperation, NORDEFCO. And last year, we actually agreed with Norway and Sweden to intensify that cooperation even further. We'll see what happens if Sweden and Finland decide to join in NATO. But I would just say, as a conclusion, that I think we've come pretty far in our cooperation on Arctic security. Of course, there's always room for more, especially also when it comes to engaging with the US. And we would be more than happy to take any advice from this conference in that direction. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much for those opening comments. So Anniken, let me come back to you to begin. Both of you, thank you. You put a lot of information and perspectives in a very short period of time. So thank you for doing that. Anniken, you noted that your experiences with the U.S. and the Arctic didn't just start as ambassador to the United States. So you go back to the time when you actually represented your country in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. So let me ask you this question. You talked about building up deterrence, not just from a Norwegian perspective, but a NATO perspective, from a bilateral, multilateral perspective. How do we balance? We're grappling with the same question I'm about to ask you. All of us are. How do we balance this buildup of deterrence with the absolute need to continue cooperation among, maybe it's becoming a tired phrase now, but one that has been revitalized, among allies and partners of like-minded nations? There is this balance that we're trying to build and project that we will build deterrence. But the North doesn't wait for that. It doesn't wait for us to have meetings to decide. It keeps going. The environment's changing. Our people need more assets, more infrastructure. How do we balance these two at this incredible dynamic time?
Well, thank you, Mike, for that question. Now, I think it is important for us to build up the deterrence, and it's important for us to do it in a way that is tailor-made for the High North. I think it's important that we coordinate with allied and partners. And my colleague Lone mentioned the close cooperation with the US, and of course we also have a very close cooperation with the US, and the US Marines are training in Norway, and we had the cold response exercise where also Finland and Sweden joined us in exercising. And I think maybe a key to the deterrence is that we coordinate among allies. It has become very, very popular to be up in the high north and in the Norwegian waters. And I think it's important for us to coordinate all this. I don't see that there should be a conflict between us, allied and partners, building up deterrence in the north, and at the same time discussing how we can deal with the global challenges, or the challenges we see in the Arctic. Of course, the one paradox is that the biggest Arctic nation is Russia, both in people and in territory. And any solutions for example, the climate crisis, the methane emissions, the greenhouse gases, any solutions without Russia would, of course, not achieve what we want for the region. We need them on board, but it's absolutely impossible to include them in any cooperation right now. So I have a hope that we can continue some cooperation in the Arctic going forward with research projects, with conferences, but we just have to do it without Russia for the moment, and then hopefully at some point we can again be together. We know that the activities of the Arctic Council is paused. Norway is supposed to take over the chairmanship in May next year, and we are ready to do that, but we will of course have to consult with allies and see how we shall do that.
Thank you for that. I know that next week, I think it's on the 12th of May, Finland will march towards their decision for NATO membership, and Sweden looks like not too far behind. At the same time, next week, our senior Arctic officials of the 7 nations will be meeting in Norway, in Tromsø, to discuss the modalities, the techniques, the activities of the future work of the Arctic Council. So your comments, of course, are right on, and it's we're watching this a nesting doll of issues emerge before our eyes. What we thought was an Arctic Council that did work the way they do it, Arctic cooperation, the frameworks in which we've built, the frameworks that we built over a long period of time, they worked. The Arctic was, for the most part, peaceful and stable. Now, in a matter of 2.5, 3 months, that has changed, including, as we speak today, preparations for very important decisions, and even next week in your home country of Norway as well. So that balance, again, important, and thank you for those perspectives. Lone, you noted, and then we're going to let the ambassadors go to do what they do each day. And we're going to, after this question, and then we'll move to the second part of the panel. And thank you for the gift of your time here today, because I know you're both very busy. But Lone, you said, of course, a number of important things, but you made me think about the complexity even more. And that is that we are dealing with what we have now called the great power competition: Russia, China, United States, and of course, other nations are in there to various degrees. You linked the reinvasion of Ukraine with Russia, and the complexities of China as having more interests in the Arctic. It's an incredibly diverse set of international dynamics, all with threads back or to or from the Arctic. So my question to you is, are we seeing a reshaping? Are we seeing a reshaping of what we have all worked to build, and reshaping of what our governance structures, our agreements, the way in which we engage in the North? Are we seeing that before our eyes? Or do you think that these institutions will endure and just maybe change a little bit, or do you think there'll be a drastic shift?
I think it's still, and thank you for the question, I think it's still early days, but I also think that, we have always underlined the Arctic Council as one of the few forums where we could actually cooperate with the Russians and we could have a dialogue, and it could be sort of low tension. And now we just have to come to the conclusion that that cannot continue, that Russia has shown that it does not want to cooperate with the West. On the contrary, it has invaded an independent country. And so there is no business as usual. And that's our point of departure. And I actually think that we should all try to have strategic patience. I think sometimes in the West we want to fix things very quickly. Okay, there's a problem. What can I do to fix it? I think maybe now is the time to have strategic patience and see how this rolls out, and see how the other global powers will act, and then find our way forward. That would be my advice, but definitely no business as usual. And I think I think at least the conclusion we have to come to is that we cannot be naive anymore. We have to be mindful of what's going on, and I think we have to be very mindful of what's going on in the Arctic. And so situational awareness is going to be crucial, and therefore also a big part of the Arctic package and capability package that I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you both, Ambassador Kutnis, Ambassador Wisberg, for providing for us insight. Great kickoff to this discussion. Is an incredibly dynamic and complex time, and I think you both have given us much to think about. It's a great foundation to build from. But this idea of strategic patience, although we in the West and friends always do want to fix things quickly, we might be seeing strategic patience in motion here as we all try to vision what could be and not throw away what we currently have. But as you both have noted, to the degree that one nation acts so incredibly different, and the horrific results of what is happening just simply cannot be dismissed or put in an Arctic exceptionalism narrative, that this has gone beyond the pale and is interrupted the global order in a way that maybe we didn't think about 3 or 4 months ago. So I want to thank you both for providing your insights, and also setting up very well the second part of today's program. I know you're both very busy. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you for being friends of the Polar Institute. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, great, wonderful, thank you. We'll now go to the second part of our discussion. What a great setup for this next part of our add-on, which is a value add in many, many ways. And it's our colleagues from the North now taking what we've just heard from the two ambassadors and putting their own perspectives in context to the issue that we're exploring today on Nordic security. And it's so hard. Just this week here in Anchorage in meetings, and I'm going to go off on a rabbit trail here for a moment, but I've heard this last week: Nordic security, North American security, Arctic security, Alaska, Canada, Greenland security. I've heard about Iceland security. And in fact, the issue is not just about Nordic security, it's about our shared security. That comes over and over, and how fast it has become an issue that the Arctic is placed so prominently in. I mean, in terms of our collective security. Whereas before it was something that many of us wrote about, we talked about, we said it was important, others said it was important. In fact, it's been a part of, as we've just heard, other Arctic nations' DNA, this issue of security in the broader sense, physical, military security, civil security, on and on. But how quickly it has now taken the front spotlight because of what's happening by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also the dynamic of Finland and Sweden looking like they will join NATO. How quickly the dynamic has changed for not just Nordic security, but perhaps for global security. So I want to thank my colleague, Andreas Oosthagen, for being the enzyme behind this discussion. Of course, all of our colleagues' bios are on the website here, but Andreas, thank you for bringing us together to have this discussion as you advance your Fulbright. And I'll just do a very quick introduction of each of you. Just very, very appreciative of you doing this with us at the Polar Institute and our colleagues who are sharing today's program. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us as well. Perspectives here are across the board. They are consistent, but insights are very much needed more than ever. And so I want to thank you for joining us today. And Christian, thank you so much for your input and your perspectives. What Andreas has brought to us today is a concept that I think we would like to continue, which is to aggregate these networks of friends and scholars to inform and influence the discussions that we were having, not just in a regional perspective, but in a global perspective. So with that, Andreas, let me turn over the floor to you for your opening comments, and then Sarah will go to you, and then Christian to you as well.
Thank you very much, Mike. Whereas you are, can you hear me? Yeah. Whereas you are in Alaska, I am, as you probably can see, in your office. I even have a distraction behind me here to try to.
There's a few dollars in my top right drawer. You may want it for coffee if you need any.
Good to know. It's quite expensive here in DC. No, but it's a pleasure being at the Wilson Center as a visiting Fulbright fellow, and a pleasure to assist in organizing this seminar to try to shed some light on a Nordic perspectives. I should also mention that I'm doing this together with another Fulbright fellow who's also here at the Wilson Center, Peter Linde, who's also working for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'll only have 3 points in about 3 to 5 minutes, so I'll try to keep it brief. And building on already also what Ambassador Krutnes has already said, I think my first point is the proximity that Norway has to Russia when we talk about, say, Nordic security perspectives or Norway's security perspective in the Arctic. And I don't think we can underestimate or state in enough times the importance of this proximity. As the only NATO country, at least to date, depending on Finland and Sweden naturally, but the only NATO country that shares a land border almost 200 kilometers long with Russia and a maritime boundary that stretches almost to the North Pole that is more than 2,000 kilometers long. And of course, this relationship with Russia, Norway as a relatively small country with only 5.5 million people, 10% of them approximately living above the Arctic Circle. Of course, that relations to Russia has defined Norwegian High North policy ever since its conception in the beginning of the millennium. When really in 2005, you see that the High North policy was raised as a domestic and foreign policy priority in Norway. In many ways, it was a result of a desire to engage with Russia, to cooperate with Russia, but also to deal with what many saw as even back then as a resurgent Russia under Vladimir Putin. And then there were some success stories that we could probably talk a lot about, whether it's the Maritime Boundary Agreement in 2010, whether it's economic cooperation when it came to oil and gas offshore, or fishery cooperation that is still ongoing. But of course, as we also all know, since 2014 in particular, things became much more difficult when it came to cooperating with Russia, and the security situation became much more tense. So this point about Norway's proximity to Russia is important to highlight when talking about Nordic security. And that also takes me to my second point, and it's if we look at then the Norway's security posture in the High North today and also since 2014, it's quite apparent. I think many researchers and analysts in the ministries and think tanks and elsewhere have already highlighted, right, that at least from a Norwegian perspective, there is no immediate concern for a conflict in the Arctic over specific Arctic issues. Right, there is no territorial grabs in the Arctic. There's no resource dispute that is warranting the outright conflict with Russia. However, the fear has always been that a conflict in other parts of the world, Ukraine in 2014, and especially right now, but also the Middle East or other parts of the world, that a conflict with some of the same actors that are in the Arctic, and of course Russia, but also thinking more broadly about the NATO alliance, that conflict would spill over into the Arctic. And that is exactly what we have seen since 2014, and what right now the situation is very much a case of. And in many ways, the argument is almost, this is my second point, that where we are right now today, from a Norwegian security perspective, is in many ways a continuation of where we have been since 2014. I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine does not change the facts on the ground in the Arctic. It's still an area for Norway that is of strategic concern. It's still an area where Russia has its nuclear submarines, and its ballistic missiles on the Kola Peninsula, just 100 miles away from the Norwegian border, which has since, I mean, you could not even say 2014, you could go back to 2008 and the Core Area Initiative, as the Ambassador Krundes also mentioned. Norway has been talking about this concern for a long time. And of course, this concern is probably at its highest point since the end of the Cold War right now, but it's a continuous concern. And that's an important point. The Arctic, it's not like the Arctic suddenly became relevant for Norwegian security or even say NATO alliance security. So that's my third point, or second point. But related to that point is also that the end goal of any Norwegian Arctic policy or security policy in the High North is to keep low tension, as the ambassador mentioned. Although that might not be the case today, this is very much where we still would like to see things develop. The government that took office 6 months ago in Norway talked about the High North or the Norwegian part of the Arctic as our most important peace project. And that is more relevant than ever. Right, the end goal of Norway is to, yes, deter Russia from aggressive actions in the Barents Sea, in the North Atlantic, but the long-term end goal is peace, stability, and status quo. But of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, things have just become so much harder to obtain that goal, or at least more challenging to obtain that goal. Although it should also be said, we haven't seen any changes on the ground in the Arctic, in the Barents Sea, at least, after the invasion. And that's perhaps something we can get to in a bit. And finally, I just also would like to touch upon what you highlighted, Mike, and also what has been mentioned, and the different aspects or issues that we have to deal with in the Arctic. And I just think it's important to separate between, say, various dynamics, where on the one hand, of course, you have what we just have talked about, the immediate security concerns of Norway when it comes to Russia, which is very much focused geographically on the North Atlantic or European parts of the Arctic. And that's something very different from the great power rivalry, strategic competition, where China in many ways is the long-term threat, and the US in many ways is the challenging actor or the lead of the Western side to try to challenge long-term strategic threats from China. And those dynamics are very different than the NATO-Russia dynamics that we see in the European Arctic, which again is something very different than the political dynamics that we see when it comes to circumpolar cooperation on, say, softer security issues or safety issues or just sustainable development. And on that note also, and Mike, since you brought it up on the Arctic Council, as I mentioned, I'm very much a proponent of continuing cooperation in the Arctic Council, also without Russia, because as you said, there are issues that are still ongoing that needs to be dealt with, despite Russia being 50% or so of the Arctic. And on that note, I would just also like to highlight that Peter and I, my collaborator here at the Wilson Center, we've written a brief report looking at how Denmark and Norway, or the Kingdom of Denmark, I should say, and Norway can collaborate more also in engaging the US on these various issues in the Arctic. And that'll be also released at the Wilson Center webpage in a few days, I hope. So thank you, Mike, for allowing me to set this up and having this debate.
Andreas, thank you very much. I mean, this is the wonderful part of a lot of our work, is that we have friends, colleagues, and networks that we can rely on that provide for us perspectives that, you know, not only place our own perspectives into perspective, but influence and inform what it is we're thinking. Let me go completely off script here for a minute. Sarah, I'm going to go to you next. But Andreas, two things. One is, just yesterday, Jim DeHart, the senior coordinator, the coordinator for the United States, reaffirmed the United States commitment to the Arctic Council as the preeminent body in which discussions that are happening now can continue on. What that looks like, we do not know, but there was a reaffirmation that the Arctic Council has a role. What that looks like, maybe we'll know a little bit more next week. I thought that was quite telling. I think it's quite important for the United States to make that statement. How that works, maybe we'll learn more about it next week, the report out from Tromsø. The second thing I wanted to ask you is that you noted that not necessarily what's happening in Ukraine today has affected, Norway had a position, a security position 2014 and even before. And so this has been an arc of consistency in terms of strategy, high awareness, hopefully low tension. But in a recent statement about Finland and Sweden's potential application for membership in NATO, the response from Moscow was threatening in a lot of ways, but also they were open to placing nuclear weapons in their Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad. Would something like that change the dynamic in Norway at all?
I mean, to your first point, Mike, about the Arctic Council, for me that makes sense. I mean, we could have a seminar, and you might do at the Wilson Center, I guess, on the rationales for keeping an A7 ongoing, whether it's from a local perspective or a climate change perspective, or it's from a keeping Arctic cooperation also with non-Arctic actors, whether we're talking about China or Japan or France ongoing. So I think there's many reasons to keep Arctic Council cooperation ongoing. But then, of course, we could also debate, what might the consequences be for the inclusion of Russia one day in the future, right? That must be the end goal, to include Russia in the future. So that's the tricky part. But that actually takes me to your second point, because if Sweden and Finland were to join NATO, as looks quite likely, then there will be 7 NATO members in the Arctic Council and 1 that is not. So perhaps that will make it impossible to ever re-establish the Arctic Council the way it was. But that's a speculative debate. But when it comes to the whole Baltic Sea discussion, I mean, you could envision that the Baltic Sea being, I mean, you say, okay, Russia is threatening to make use of or station nuclear weapons. I guess there's been that's not necessarily a new thing, right? And to throw around that threat, I don't necessarily think that's having the impact that Russia wants it to have. And in many ways, what's going to happen permanently when or if Sweden and Finland joins NATO is that the Baltic Sea is closed off completely to Russia, and it becomes even less relevant strategically for Russia. That might again make the Arctic, the Kola Peninsula, the Northern Fleet even more important strategically for Russia, even more crucial, which then again puts more pressure on the NATO posture, the Norwegian defense posture in the north, but then with Sweden and with Finland. So I'm not too concerned about Russian statements like those, but because all honesty, I think they have an agenda that is not really aligned with ours when it comes to Sweden and Finland. And I think Sweden and Finland in many ways are being pushed into the NATO alliance because of Russian statements such as those in the first place.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Our next speaker and colleague, Sarah Ulfbig, PhD fellow at the Center for Foreign and Security Policy at the University of Greenland. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us, and let me turn the virtual floor over to you.
Oh, yeah, no, thank you. I'm very honored to be invited to this panel, and also very happy that there's an interest in hearing about the perspectives from Greenlandic researchers. I want to start out by saying that the war in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine has put Greenland in a situation where we see a very, very clear message from the government of Greenland in being clearly part of the Western alliance. We saw that immediately after the invasion of Ukraine was initiated, and through the sanctions that were imposed on Russia, which the government of Greenland immediately also joined. I will not say that that is a new thing or an unexpected thing, but it is an interesting thing that it comes out that clearly. We also saw very clear messages from Greenland on a wish to be a very close partner to the US when the US Secretary of State Blinken visited Greenland very early in both the government of Greenland's term and the US government's term. And here we also saw very, very clear messages from the government of Greenland that Greenland is part of the democratic world, sharing those values. So that is sort of the starting point. And I wanted also to touch upon three perspectives that makes all of this very complex. And I will talk about this generally for the Arctic, but with Greenland as a specific case. So as we have heard today and all know, the Arctic has been highly institutionalized. And this institutionalization is now, to say it mildly, very challenged with the pause in the Arctic Council. What I think we need to be more aware of in talking about the Arctic Council is the unique structure of the Arctic Council, seen from the perspective of Arctic peoples. Because as an institution in the Arctic, as a forum for cooperation, the Arctic Council has, right from the beginning, included the 6 permanent participants, so the Indigenous Peoples organizations representing Arctic peoples, but it has also made sure that there was space, for example, for self-governing nations such as Greenland to be at the table. There was a period during a Swedish chairmanship about 10 years back where there was a dispute on that and Greenland boycotted the Arctic Council. But the fact that this unique structure has been there from the start in the Arctic Council is something that we must bring with us in our search for solutions to how then now, during this war, collaborate in the Arctic. Because what we are seeing now, and that is my first point, is that we are trying to build, or the states are trying to build new platforms of cooperation that do not necessarily build on that unique structure of inclusion of the Arctic peoples themselves. And that poses a challenge to the legitimacy of decision-making in the Arctic. And this is where I have written something in this PhD project that I'm working on. The legitimacy, the question of legitimacy in decision-making. It is a specific challenge in the relation between Greenland and Denmark and the Faroe Islands and Denmark. And it is a specific challenge also on matters of foreign policy and security, or even defense. The situation for a lot of former colonial relations, for example, also for Greenland as a post-colonial society with some degree of self-determination, is that for states, there's not very sound traditions of making sure that the peoples of the Arctic, for example, Greenland, takes part in the decision-making on, for example, foreign policy, security, and defense issues. Foreign policy has been a special situation for Greenland because that is where we have seen through the years that Greenland has widened its, what I would call a room for maneuver on international relations. But on the security and defense side, it's more difficult. And this, of course, has to do with the state of Denmark having a constitution that is very clear on who holds responsibility on these areas as well. But in practical terms, it does pose legitimacy issues if Arctic peoples and, for example, the government of Greenland is not at the table, or if the voice is not heard. So as part of that first point, the conclusion for me is that there's a very serious challenge that we must take seriously in regards to when we talk about the future of the Arctic in this terrible situation of conflict. Who do we invite to the table? Who do we invite to speak? And here the government of Greenland is a very important voice because it has maintained and developed a very high degree of self-determination. Both that, but also because decisions that are taken in the Parliament of Greenland by the government of Greenland, they also impact the development in the Arctic, and they also impact the security development, as we have seen, for example, on the debates of whether the US should invest in critical infrastructure in Greenland, or who does Greenland trade with when they decide on opening mines and that kind of things. So it only benefits the states to make sure that the peoples are at the table and the people's voices and self-governing nations' voices are heard. My second point is that the pause in the Arctic Council now also leaves space for non-Arctic states that do not either carry that tradition of including the Arctic peoples themselves. An example, and I'm not the right person to evaluate if it's a good or bad thing, that the British presented a defense strategy on the Arctic recently. It is an interesting publication, and it is also important in the eyes of the alliance, I would say. But I note that the strategy does not, it speaks very, very little of the Arctic peoples. And just a small thing, for example, when mentioning the Kingdom of Denmark, I know that the Greenlandic politicians notice when it only says Denmark. So there's a challenge now because the space has opened up for doing things in another way than through the Arctic Council. Although the Arctic Council has never worked with security, but building on the tradition of including Arctic peoples themselves, that has become open for other actors from around the world that do not know of that tradition or have not dealt with that tradition. And I think that is going to be a challenge for Arctic peoples and the democratic legitimacy of the development in the Arctic. The third thing and last thing is that now we have a lot of webinars, and we discuss these all the time. It is very important that we do that to maintain the dialogue. But building on my first and second point, what we must also be careful of is that, as we also know from the Arctic Council, which has been quite good at that, looking at knowledge systems, looking at worldviews, looking at whose knowledge is the knowledge. Here, I have also been previously, during the last couple of months, make sure that we avoid, first of all, tokenism. So when we do processes, do publications, that there's that one Indigenous person on the panel, or that you mention, well, this was in hearing among those and those. If the decisions are to be nuanced and strong, it requires true and equal participation. So it is very important, as I see it, for a healthy development of the Arctic in this very stressful situation, that we avoid tokenism, that we reach a true level of equal partnerships and mutual respect, which are actually the words from the preambular paragraph of the self-government agreement between Greenland and Denmark. But it's a continuous challenge to actually reach those values, seen from a Greenlandic perspective, if we listen to the Greenlandic politicians anyway. And the second thing is that I'm also here at the university. Our university system is also based on a Western knowledge system, but we actually do have researchers that study decolonization of knowledge. And in the Arctic, I have also seen that across the Arctic, it has become there's increased attention to what kind of knowledge we base our decision-making on, or we base our debates on. So the second thing here is that we should avoid coming to the Arctic with a deficit-based approach, meaning that we approach the Arctic thinking that we bring the right knowledge because there is not enough knowledge to those we bring that to. And I say that because, as we have seen throughout the Arctic Council years, knowledge from the Arctic peoples themselves have only increased the value of the Council itself, of decisions that are taken, of solutions that are found. And I think that would be a very important point to bring with us in these struggles that we are having ahead, that we are seeing ahead in maintaining dialogue and maintaining a healthy Arctic for the Arctic peoples. So I'll stop at that. Bojana.
So thank you so very much. I think your 3 points, incredibly important that we not lose sight as we talk about these big geopolitics and big governance structures, one of the things that makes the Arctic Council unique, as you said so eloquently, is the fact that permanent participants, Indigenous people, have been involved in this, perhaps not to the degree that has been needed, but a recognition from the beginning that it was essential. And I think I like the trend. This is just Mike speaking, but I like the trend of recognition that it's not just a placeholder for 6 permanent participants, but the growing, at least from my perspective, the growing understanding, the persistent, and by the way, we're going to go over about 5 minutes from our time. We have the all clear from our friends at the Wilson Center, so thank you all. But this consistent narrative from the permanent participants and other Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, forcing maybe perhaps closed ears to understand not only is it the right thing to do, but the value, how essential the permanent participants and other Indigenous groups are to the very narratives that we have been talking about and the work of the Arctic Council, because it's not just about a council, it's the work of the North for all of us that live in the North. So your reminder that must continue. And I think what you're suggesting here, rightfully so in my opinion, is that this take on a new meaning. What does it mean to be involved? What does it mean to be at the table? Who owns that table? And what perspectives can you bring to that table, even if they are in the security dimensions, maybe not in the Arctic Council, but there are security interests that are interesting and should be listened to and inform and influence national, right? Maybe they don't have the say over it, but they have some influence. They inform maybe national perspectives in the most appropriate way. Finally, your note about webinars, and who gets to put them together, who gets to decide what the title is, who gets to decide what's important to have on a webinar like this, and avoiding, your word tokenism is absolute. I can tell you we have all struggled with this is meaningful, but we can't do it in a way that is just we've checked a box, because this is not about checking boxes. This is about crafting our collective future. So I want to thank you for bringing up all of those. I hope that I've reflected your comments accurately and I didn't put any words or themes in your mouth. You can say I was wrong on any of those. I'd give you a moment to push back on any of the things I just said.
No, thank you very much. I think it's right on spot.
Okay.
And the last, another point that I think should be mentioned is that often I see that we as researchers, we think about Indigenous peoples as if Indigenous peoples are not concerned about hard security issues, but exactly in the Arctic, looking, for example, at Inuit, which we in Greenland are part of, and which, by the way, also live in Russia. And maybe for that reason, right from the beginning of the first Inuit meetings in the end of the 70s, high and politics and hard security issues were on the agenda. So they are on the agenda for Indigenous peoples in the Arctic as well. And I think we have to remember that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Treon and my friends at the Wilson Center, thank you so much for allowing us to go a few minutes over. It always happens in our discussions. I'm not sure about other programs, but in discussions about the Arctic, there's so much to pack into such a small amount of time. So thank you for allowing us to go a little bit over. Christian Christensen, senior researcher, the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Christian, thank you for your patience. Certainly last, but certainly not least, please, for your perspectives, please don't rush through your comments, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you also, Andreas, for arranging this seminar at this crucial time, I think, for global politics and for Arctic politics as well. And I just a caveat, I think a warning. I think, unfortunately, my comments are not going to be on the positive side, because I think a lot of bad consequences have come out of this horrible war, and the same is the case for Arctic securities. I think one of the things that has surprised me has been sort of the number of unexpected or tragic second order events coming out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? From increased energy insecurity and food insecurity in the global south to what I fear is if not the complete loss of the regional order in the Arctic, then at least the Arctic Council has been put in deep coma, and the question, and I think Andreas and Sarah, you both mentioned this as well. The question is for how long can it be kept in a coma? Can it be revived, and in what form can one stand up a regional order, and with what actors? And what is the meaning of a regional order that doesn't include Russia? It is a very partial regional order anyway. So I think that is a very sort of critical consequence of the war. But Andreas, you also mentioned that a lot of things were also sort of more continuity than change, right? And I think that is a very paradoxical consequence, or very paradoxical character of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. That it at the very same time, it's completely new. It is a sort of a case example of what a crisis is. New things are possible, right? Sweden and Finland apply for NATO membership, but at the same time, it's also a continuation or an acceleration of existing trends. And I think that's probably one of them from a hard security perspective in the Arctic. I think one of the key things is that this is precisely a continuation or an intensification of an already existing focus on military balancing in the Arctic. So in that sense, what we will probably see is more of the same. So more military activity from all parties, more insecurity, more instability, perhaps also crisis on a higher level. But the flip side of that is then even more need for crisis communication, for risk reduction, for deconfliction initiatives, for what one could call regionalization of the military balancing. And I think both parties will increasingly again realize that there is a demand for that. Of course, putting it on the agenda will be difficult, but I actually see that that's perhaps one of the few openings where one can actually have a debate with the Russian paradoxically on hard security issues. Another thing then that I want to highlight is that I can foresee and also perhaps already sort of see, not just foresee, but actually see is an increased risk or increased threat of hybrid threats and challenges. And I think this will take probably two forms. One will be sort of the more sort of quote unquote classical hybrid threat from Russia in terms of sort of internal security, espionage, cyber attacks. There was, for instance, a major cyber attack on the home rule government infrastructure in Greenland a couple of weeks ago. That, as at least that was stated from the authorities, that this was a state-based actor breaking into government servers to do espionage. And I think that will then sort of the internal security version of hybrid threats and challenges probably will also be complemented by an increased risk of Russia contesting rights, rules, and regulations in the Arctic. I think because as we will increasingly see a political and economic decoupling in the Arctic, that then in a sense also decreases the costs and risks of Russia playing shenanigans with sort of established rules and norms in the region. And this can very well go hand in hand with maintaining some of the good cooperation that Russia and the Arctic states will inevitably want to continue, for instance, in Coast Guard cooperation and on fisheries management. The opportunities there and the risks associated for Russia in doing it is increased. So unfortunately, I see an increasingly divided Arctic that will bifurcate into a Western and a Russian Arctic that will be politically isolated, marked by military competition, and increasingly economically also decoupled, I think with severe consequences, especially for Russia. So what then to do about that? And I think this just basically to keep a focus on maintaining military to military channel in order to maintain stability and crisis management, and look for opportunities to expand confidence building measures if at all possible. And then, as as Ambassador Vispo said, basically wait, while contemplating for how long the Arctic Council can actually remain in a coma and be revived into something meaningful at a later point in time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christian. I don't know if you've brought us dark clouds. I don't think you've done that today. I think you've brought us a dose of reality, something that we're having to deal with, but done in a way that is, you've communicated this in a way that reflects, at least in my opinion, where we are. And unless we recognize where we are, the realities of this, I don't know how we navigate a new north. I mean, I used this phrase up until 3 months ago, a new north, meaning something completely different. Now we're talking about a new north in the ways that you're talking about it. So, you need not apologize for projecting what is perhaps our shared reality. I like the idea of this paradox that you've teased out, because we're living this paradox here where, yes, we were on a trajectory where there was more militarization. We were on a trajectory where perhaps we were trying to deal with instability issues, trying to keep it high north, low tension, working very hard at that. But over the course of several years, we've watched increased training, increased the use of the Arctic as a weapons terrain to test new weapons systems. We can keep going on. More activity in the GIUK gap. You can unfortunately list those. And now what you've provided for us is that this really is an arc of activity that we have seen, and now it's grown to this area of where we are today. So I think absolutely many of us are working on risk reduction ideas, deconfliction ideas, and have been reinforcing the idea of communication, mill to mill, and others. Yes, it's paradox that we need that more than ever, but as the ambassadors pointed out, how very difficult to do that at this particular time globally, but also in the Arctic as well. But I think you've given us the right dose of reality here for this discussion. So I thank you very much for that. We're close to ending up the time here. So I want to thank everyone here, but I want to give Andreas the final word to close out this session. Let me just say that I wish we had 4 hours on this, right? So Andreas, you and Peter, and we're going to have our work cut out for us, along with, we're not going to let our friends online and their institutions get off the hook either. I think we have a good network here to maybe tease out a series of these kind of great town hall discussions, because really that's what these have turned out to be, very casually professional town hall discussions about the state of our region. And we're bringing our friends from Harvard and others and anyone else who would like to participate. But I think what you have started here today is showing, among many things, the power of the Fulbright as well. The Fulbright Arctic Initiative, bringing together those who are focused on the Arctic, along with other colleagues from the Arctic, and connecting that a Fulbright program isn't just about an exchange. For the Arctic, Ross Virginia, who co-developed the program with me, and our good friend, our idea for this Fulbright Arctic Initiative was not just another Fulbright. It was about the urgent work, basic and applied research that you can put in motion right now for the people of the North, for the North. I'm stealing my good friend Lars, the president of UArctic's phrase here, but it's of the North, for the North. And you've set that in motion here today in just the beginning of this conversation. So Andreas, I'm going to give you the final word to close out this session. And thank you very much for bringing this great program to fruition. And of course, always thanks to Jack Durkee for making everything happen that happens with the Polar Institute and our good friends back at the Wilson Center. Andreas?
Thank you so much, Mike, and thanks to the whole team for allowing us to go a few minutes over time. And as you say, also, especially thanks to Jack for putting everything in place, and also to Peter, my fellow Fulbright here at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's also here with me in DC. I won't touch on all the points that was mentioned. I just maybe would like to touch on two specifically, and it's one that Christian Søberg Christensen just highlighted, and this is notion of a divided Arctic. But at the same time, there are certain issues in the Arctic, right, that still requires cooperation. Whether we're talking about those countries that actually share a border or a boundary at sea with Russia, like Norway does, or like the US also does. The US Coast Guard continues dialogue with the Russian Coast Guard in case of emergencies. So does the Norwegian Coast Guard. So you have those issues, and you could talk about climate change, or dealing with oil spill response, or a number of issues in the Arctic that also require some form of cooperation, whether that's through the Arctic Council or otherwise. And as also Sara Olsvik was talking about, when thinking about new forms of cooperation, maybe this is a good idea or a good chance then to reimagine a bit who we include in those forums and in those dialogues. So I think I'll leave it at that. The positive note perhaps then is that Nordic cooperation seems to be the solution. At least that's what we always say in the Nordic countries, right? We could debate about Sweden and Finland joining NATO, but I would in many ways like to argue for more Nordic cooperation as a consequence of what has happened in Ukraine, unfortunately, but also in a wider sense. And that's what Petter and I are also doing here in Washington, D.C. So perhaps that's one positive thing to take from this discussion. So thank you to everyone, and thank you, Mike, for hosting us in this seminar.
Thank you all very much. And thank you for putting up with the fact that I'm in the middle of a conference hall running this, participating in this very important discussion. So I apologize for that, but what a great panel. Thank you all very much. And we'll see you, hopefully many of you soon in Tromsø. If not, we'll be back online with more of these discussions. So thank you again very much. Andreas, Peter, the whole team, thank you. Christian, Sarah, thank you so much. Ambassadors, thank you. I think some of you have stayed online with us and we really appreciate that. Thank you. And we'll soon see you again in another one of our Polar Institute programs. Thank you.